Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Cognitive and Perceptual Barriers to Green Infrastructure, Local Decision Making in Rhode Island, brought to you on behalf of the SNEP Network. My name is Leah Soloway from the New England Environmental Finance Center, and I'll be assisting with logistics for today's program, along with my colleague, Tess Clark from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center, who will be helping facilitate a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Before we get into the presentation, I want to draw your attention to the GoToWebinar questions dialog box. You'll be able to ask questions by typing them into the questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We really look forward to answering questions, so please type them in at any time. There'll be a question and answer discussion at the end of the webinar. Additionally, everyone will be on mute to ensure audio quality. If we ask for audience feedback, please engage with us through the questions box. Now for a little bit about the SNEP network. Here you can see a map of the Southeast New England program region. The SNEP network's mission is to empower communities to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable financing, and long-term climate resilience through management of stormwater and restoration projects. We focus on building local capacity by providing no-cost trainings, webinars, and technical assistance to communities in the SNEP region. If you want to learn more, please visit snepnetwork.org for more information. And on that note, I'd like to hand things over to our presenter today, Kyle Gray. Kyle, thank you so much for being here today, and I'll send things over to you.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Leah. I am going to share my screen and we should be good to go. All right, so you should all be able to see this and we can get started. So thank you everyone so much for joining us this afternoon. I always love giving this presentation, given that it was my master's thesis research, so I spent quite a bit of time working on this. But again, my name's Kyle Gray. I am a project partner at Throw Environmental, which is one of the core partner organizations within the SNEP network. And we focus a lot on environmental finance, climate resilience, and leadership development. I recently completed this project titled Cognitive and Perceptual Barriers to Green Infrastructure, Local Decision Making in Rhode Island, as part of my master's thesis research at the university. I just finished that up this past spring, and the research was conducted between August 2020 and May of 2021, which I'd personally say is probably the worst time to do a master's thesis research given the global pandemic. But nonetheless, this project is, kind of a smaller piece of the broader green infrastructure and stormwater management conversation. And it's also a really critical and growing piece, working to take down some of those barriers to broader green infrastructure implementation and making sure that green infrastructure adoption and maintenance happens smoother and more effectively. So with that, I do just want to, before we get started, acknowledge the thesis committee that supported me throughout this entire project. So first and foremost, I have Dr. Richard Burrows, who was my master's thesis advisor. He's a professor of marine affairs at the university, and he was tremendously helpful throughout this entire project. I also had Dr. Catherine Lacoste, who's a professor of psychology at Rhode Island College, and Dr. Tom Boving, who is a professor of civil and environmental engineering and geosciences at URI. And then finally, Professor Aaron Lay is a political science professor and the head of the Masters in Public Administration program at URI. And he facilitated my thesis defense. So with that, I'm going to shut my camera off to share some bandwidth, to save some bandwidth, and we can get started. So before we dive in, I just want to go over a quick overview of kind of where we're going in this presentation. So I'll start off with some background on the topic of green infrastructure and give a little bit about the context of this study. I'll turn to my methodology and focus on how I was conducting the study and report out a little bit of the turnout. And then finally, the majority of the conversation will focus on the results of this study. I'll share a little bit of a discussion on that. And then we'll finish up with some recommended best practices and final thoughts for this topic moving forward. So to begin, we'll cover some background and context. And we have to ask the critical question before we start, what is green infrastructure? And even though there are definitions out there that are very clear and succinct, I personally think from this research that it's a little bit difficult to find a hard and fast definition of what green infrastructure is and a definition that everyone can agree with, because there tends to be a little bit of variance there on what folks consider to be green infrastructure. So the operational definition that I worked with for this project was something along the lines of this one that you see on screen, which states that green infrastructure is the collection of natural or nature-based systems and practices that are used primarily to manage stormwater runoff, right? And it does so through storing, infiltrating, evapotranspirating stormwater runoff at its source, right? And you see two examples on screen of different green infrastructure best management practices, or BMPs. So on the left, we've got bioswales, which are a little bit of a more traditional green infrastructure practice. They store the stormwater that comes in and infiltrates it. And then we have green roofs on the right, which are a little bit more novel, definitely more urban. And again, just another practice that will infiltrate the stormwater and evapotranspirate it to put it back into the rain cycle. So that's what green infrastructure is. And again, we have to ask the question, why are we using it? And by and large, green infrastructure is used, as I mentioned, to treat stormwater at its source. And this is because we need to prevent non-point source pollution from entering our waterways. So when we talk about non-point source pollution, as many of you probably know, we're talking about all those diffuse pollutants that can be collected on our impermeable surfaces throughout our communities, right? So the agricultural fertilizers, the runoff, the pollutants from our cars, pet waste, all of that is collected in parking lots and on sidewalks and streets. And when we have this high impermeable surface area, that water that isn't soaking into the ground collects those pollutants and carries it into our coastal waterways, leading to poorer water quality. So in a sense, impermeable surface area can be a direct proxy for water quality. And that's an important point that we'll be bringing up later in this discussion. But so stormwater management is the primary reason for green infrastructure, but it's really important and very important for this discussion specifically to talk about the different co-benefits to green infrastructure, right? And there are several different advantages from having additional green space in our communities, right? And these different advantages really offer us some opportunities for efficiencies. So rather than making green infrastructure just a practice that focuses on stormwater management, we can incorporate some other things as well. So for example, we can think about recreation co-benefits. And as just one example, green infrastructure can be integrated into parks, or it can be integrated into porous play surfaces, like a basketball court or a tennis court, allowing the stormwater to collect and be treated as the primary benefit, but also offering those recreational benefits of having, new places for the community to enjoy. And we've got increased property values, just having more green space near people's homes and businesses. The presence of urban landscaping has been proven to increase property values, and thus, that brings in some tax revenue as well to our communities. And then this last one I'll touch on is walkability. And we can think about how comprehensive community developments or development plans, different plans to improve a downtown's aesthetics or make it a bit more pedestrian friendly. All of that, by using green infrastructure, can have the co-benefits of walkability, and it can benefit tourism, all these different areas. So with that, I will pause for a moment. Tess, I think we're going to run a quick poll.
Great, thanks, Kyle. You guys might hear me chime in from time to time with the polls and the questions. You're hearing from Tess Clark right now. And what we're asking you to tell us is, which of the following co-benefits of green infrastructure have you experienced or are familiar with? You can check multiple. Oh, shoot. Check only the one that you've seen the most. I apologize. That's supposed to be a check all question. And I'm going to give you a few more seconds to respond. I'm closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay, Kyle, it looks like 41% of folks said that the most common co-benefit that they experienced was public health benefits. And then that was followed by economic, and then aesthetics, and then in last place was the two least checked were environmental justice and other.
All right, great. This is great to see, and really kind of like an informal extension of this project. It allows us to see, how folks are elevating those co-benefits to green infrastructure and what's working and maybe what's not. So good to hear from everyone, and we can have a little bit more of a discussion about that later on. But I will pick it up here. And so we have to think about the regulatory drivers at play that are kind of the context for this larger study. And again, it comes back to stormwater management. Even though we see all those co-benefits, stormwater management and the regulation thereof is still the primary driving factor here, right? So we see that the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, regulates municipal stormwater discharges in urbanized areas through the NPDES program, and that's the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. So we know NPDES regulates these municipal stormwater discharges, and in doing so, we can see that EPA strongly encourages the use of green infrastructure, not just in general, but specifically for these NPDES permits, right? So not only does EPA like green practices for stormwater management, it specifically likes and supports those practices for communities to be in compliance with their NPDES permits, right? So that's great. But when we think about the challenges that local governments face, EPA also notes that the very same municipalities that are in the best position to promote sustainable stormwater management also face some of the most complex challenges to green infrastructure implementation, right? So what that means is, despite being in perhaps the best spot of any governance actor to push forward green infrastructure, municipal leaders face some of the most complex challenges to broader green infrastructure implementation. And we've got some of those examples on screen. We've got the political, the institutional barriers, we've got the financial and the technical barriers. And then the ones I focused on here are the perceptual and cognitive. And I'll talk a little bit about what those are. And then I think we'll do another poll after this. So to start us off with, we've got these cognitive barriers, and those really focus on how we're interpreting, utilizing, accessing, and conveying information. And information is the operative word there, right? Cognitive barriers essentially are synonymous with information, and we can split those up into kind of two categories. So we've got informational inputs, which really has to do with how we as individuals are taking information in, right? How we're accessing it, how aware we are of information. And then we have information outputs, thinking about how we're conveying it or putting it out to other people, how we're communicating it, things like that. We've got some examples on the screen here, and I'll touch on a bunch more as we get into the results section. But again, thinking about how unaware of someone is of a piece of information, or how accessible that is, falls into the bucket of information inputs. And then how we're communicating it will fall into that bucket of information outputs. And when we talk about perceptual barriers, we can think of those as being the barriers that affect how we understand, perceive, or feel about something, right? And we can equally split this up into two different buckets. So we've got external perceptions, which just means how we as individuals feel about other things outside of ourselves, and how we think those things are inhibiting broader green infrastructure implementation. So for example, funding comes up quite a bit in these green infrastructure conversations, right? Perhaps there's not enough funding for a community to put in a green infrastructure practice. So if you're perceiving funding to be a barrier, that's an external barrier because it's outside of yourself. When we're talking about internal perceptual barriers, those are your own attitudes, how you're framing something, how you're thinking about it, that have the potential to kind of inhibit broader implementation. And we've got some examples on screen as well. So again, unfavorable attitudes will be barriers that are inside ourselves. And then if we think about things like funding and maintenance, those will be external barriers that kind of hold the process up. So before we jump onto the next slide, we can run our second poll.
Great, thanks, Kyle. So for this one, you can select multiple barriers that you've come in contact with. So please let us know which of the following barriers to green infrastructure implementation have you encountered in your work. You can select more than one. So your options are political, institutional, financing, maintenance, or the last is cognitive or perceptual barriers, which you just heard a little bit about. And it looks like most people have responded, so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll in 3, 2, and 1. Okay, so it looks like financing barriers were the most commonly selected, and that's tied with maintenance barriers. But everyone seemed to think that with over 44% of people selecting the lowest one, which was political, it looks like they're all pretty common, Kyle.
Yeah, I think there's no surprise here, right? Like we've seen, and as the research shows, that these barriers are significant. And as I mentioned earlier, perhaps the most significant here are the perceptual, or the funding and the financing ones, right? Those can really get in the way of broader green infrastructure implementation.
Kyle, I think our screens might have frozen just briefly with the poll. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly just switch screens and then make you the presenter again.
Got it. Perfect, there we are. Thanks, Tess. All right, so as I was saying, the financing and maintenance barriers that came out of that poll are no surprise because those often come out as two of the biggest external perceptual barriers that exist when we're talking about green infrastructure. But it was great to see almost half of the folks that just voted in that poll recognize that there are those cognitive and perceptual barriers. And I want to note that I pulled these out as two that were understudied on this entire topic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the biggest and the baddest barriers when we're talking about this topic, right? They're just some that the research isn't there, which gave us a kind of an excellent reason to study this topic and gives us a natural transition into this next slide where we will talk about the study's purpose. So really here, I was focusing on the task at hand, which was to explore and describe the cognitive and perceptual barriers and to offer solutions for better understanding and wider implementation of green infrastructure at the local level in the state of Rhode Island. And in doing so, I laid out 4 different research questions. So first was really just a basic question asking how local decision makers perceive different technologies for stormwater management, right? So not really focusing on green infrastructure here, just very broadly saying, what do folks think or what are they perceiving when we're talking about gray, green, or a hybrid of the two? And then our next 2 questions very plainly ask, what are some of the cognitive and perceptual barriers to greater green infrastructure implementation? And then finally, I ask, what are some strategies that could lead to greater implementation at the local level in Rhode Island? Right, so these framed out the entire study, which was carried out in 3 different phases. So when we talk about phase 1, that is my literature review. And as most literature reviews do, it focused on case studies. I really looked at a couple of different national, regional, and state examples. And I did this for 3 reasons. I wanted to pull together all of the information that I could gather from these different examples and look at the different lessons learned from communities that have already put in green infrastructure practices. Beyond that, I wanted to form an interview guide, which I will talk about as we get to phase 2. And then finally, I wanted to frame out the potential strategies for better implementation and wider understanding in the state of Rhode Island by using some examples that come from communities that have already succeeded with green infrastructure. So that was key. So phase 2 of this project, again, focused on interviews. And I conducted semi-structured interviews with 14 different communities, and we heard from 16 different decision makers from those communities. So you can kind of see a breakdown here. So out of the 38 municipalities in the state, and that's excluding Block Island, 29 of those municipalities were targeted for interviews via email or phone. So that's about 3/4 of the state. And then of those 29, 16 came in saying yes or no, that they wanted to participate. And out of those 16 responses, 14 agreed to participate in the study. And we heard from 16 individuals, right? So we had a couple communities with 2 different interviewees on the same call. So we heard from about 1/3 of the state, which is great and exactly what you want in an academic study like this. And when we talk about who exactly I was interviewing, it's important to keep that category pretty broad. So I called them municipal decision makers, but it really is just the member of municipal government who is responsible for making those decisions about green infrastructure and stormwater management. And the reason you have to keep this broad is because if you know anything about municipal governance in Rhode Island, you know that it varies from town to town, right? There's no standardized way of doing this necessarily. So in about 1/4 of the communities that I heard from, it was a planner who took on this role. And then in about another 1/4, we heard from engineers, and there was some, public works and community economic development folks, those came in. But an equal 1/4, 28% or so, came into this interview, and we had to categorize them as other because there were so many different roles at play here, right? So this just goes to underscore that green infrastructure governance in Rhode Island at the local level is carried out by a range of different individuals. And it's really hard to pinpoint who those folks are. And now we can look at kind of who actually came in, right? So you'll see a map on the left with all of the different communities that were represented in this interview. And I won't go through one by one. You don't need to hear an exhaustive list since you can see it on screen. But we heard from folks all around the state, which was fantastic. And the way I kind of narrowed down who I would be talking to in this study was from what we call purposive and snowball sampling, which is just academic jargon. That means I picked and I chose who we were talking to. And I didn't do so arbitrarily. I did so kind of with a couple different metrics in mind. So the first one you'll see is this bar graph on the bottom right. And it brings us back to that idea of impermeable surface area and water quality that we talked about on the first or second slide. And essentially, I wanted to make sure that of the different communities in the state, we realize that there's a range of different percentages of impermeable surface area, right? The more urban communities up and around Providence and by Newport tend to have more impermeable surface. And then the more rural communities in the western part of the state tend to have lower impermeable surface, right? And that's, again, a direct proxy for water quality. So when picking these communities and kind of targeting specific folks for interviews, this idea of making sure we had a normal distribution on this topic of impermeable surface area and water quality was important. And I'm very happy to report back that we were able to get that. We got, as you can see in this graph, what tends to be a pretty standard bell curve here. So that was great. And then I also narrowed down who we were talking to based on geography. So we heard from municipalities from coastal and inland communities, as well as East Bay and West Bay. So spanning the entire state, but I wanted to make sure this was as representative as possible of the state of Rhode Island. And these splits that you see on screen, more or less 35 to 65 and 55 to 45, they're slightly skewed towards coastal East Bay communities, but not by very much. So I will note that these findings do tend to lean more towards those coastal East Bay communities, but that doesn't mean that they're not applicable to the West Bay or to more inland communities. We still, we're pretty close to that actual split in the state of Rhode Island. So in terms of representativeness, we were right about there. And then finally, I'll just note that interviews were conducted with a loose interview guide where I had kind of a set of questions that I knew going into each interview, but I allowed the interviewee to kind of guide that conversation. So if one topic came through as more important in one interview and a different one came in through another, that was perfectly fine. But there was kind of a parallel way of structuring those conversations. So when we got to this third phase, which is coding and analysis, I was able to compare all of these findings. So I transcribed the interviews that I had done. I coded and organized those transcripts, pulling out the different themes and kind of jotting down keywords and key points that came out. And then I constructed what we call a thematic network or a concept map with these different themes. And that concept map you'll see in just a moment, that will structure the entire results section of this study. So these are our phases of research, phase 1, 2, and 3. And before I get into what the actual results of this discussion are, I do want to pause. Everything we've heard kind of up to this point has been setting up the findings of this study. And then now we'll move on to what those findings are and what they mean for practitioners in the state of Rhode Island. So we can pause here. And folks, if you have any questions, feel free to use that questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we can hear from folks that way. So I see one question coming in saying, did you identify this or did they self-identify? I'm thinking it would be both planning and economic development, and our engineers would also be DPW. So that's a good question. So I'm just based on how that's written, it looks like we're talking about the job roles here. And it was a little bit of both. So in the beginning, when I was targeting folks, I went off of the state's aggregated stormwater management list. So I knew going into it who, or more or less what main role each interviewee would have, just because that was publicly available information. But I did also ask folks what their job was within the city. So in a way, they were also self-identifying. So I might have someone say that they were responsible for public works, but that also meant that they had a hand in managing maybe the wastewater system, or perhaps they, did some engineering too, crossing different departments. So yeah, as we mentioned, planning and economic development kind of crossing over was definitely an area where we would see that. Another question asking, was I able to assess how each municipality had been involved in SNEP or other stormwater specific training or education in recent years? A very good question, and we'll actually be touching on that, I think, on this next slide. But just to give you a little bit of taste on what we're going to say, Yeah, so I was able to kind of gauge how municipalities were kind of getting information or training on stormwater management, or maybe getting education in recent years, as you asked. So I asked folks, where they get their information, how often they were seeking out green infrastructure information, questions, more or less in that vein. And the idea there was to get at those cognitive barriers, right? Remembering how much those cognitive barriers focus on information and how those informational inputs really deal with how we're taking in information. That was definitely a key focus going into the interview stage, and something I wanted to make sure we touched on. So with that, I do not see any more questions right now, so we will move forward with the results section. But as I progress through the last two sections of this presentation, definitely feel free to keep sending in your questions, and we will go through those as we wrap up in the next half hour or so. All right, so as I mentioned on the last slide, we can go through our results by way of a concept map, right? And when we put together a concept map, it has these different levels, right? There's a hierarchy here. So we've got this broad topic of green infrastructure decision making, and that's obviously what this entire project's about, right? And then I focused in on these barriers, the cognitive and perceptual. And I found that not only do they affect each other, but they do, in fact, inhibit broader green infrastructure implementation. And then, as I've kind of alluded to, we can break those barriers down into different subcategories, or what I call nodes. So on the cognitive side, we've got, once more, those informational inputs, how we're taking in information, and then those outputs, how we're conveying it or communicating it back to others. And then on the perceptual side, we can do the same thing and split that into two categories. We've got external perceptions, how we're perceiving those things outside of us to be a barrier to the overall process. And then we've got internal perceptions, our own attitudes, our own framing, how the ideas that we have about green infrastructure, and how that might be kind of holding up the whole process, right? So these are kind of the categories that I operated within and that kind of came out of this research, right? So I knew there was going to be these cognitive and perceptual barriers, but I wasn't exactly clear on how they'd be split up into these different nodes. So that was something that came out of this study. And then, of course, there are different examples of each one of these, right? And we've got several under each of these subcategories, right? We've got awareness and accessibility, we have communications issues, we've got understanding and framing. So there's a lot here. So rather than going through this kind of with the concept map as a whole, we're going to dive in section by section. So I'll leave this on screen for one more second just so you can see it, and then we will start with information inputs. All right. So when we start with informational inputs, we can begin by talking about awareness and accessibility. And again, we're talking about awareness of and access to information related to green infrastructure, right? So it's all about the information. In general, we saw that there was a good awareness and folks had easy access to general information related to green infrastructure. And when I say general information, I'm talking about those, those 101 webinars, how to incorporate LID, basic workshops, things like that, right? Where we're getting a kind of overview of the topic as a whole. That was all out there, and folks tended to have a good awareness of that and knew how to get a hold of it, right? What was a little bit weaker was the availability or the awareness of information related to folks' specific needs, right? So the difference here is that when we're talking about things like site design or cost estimate or monitoring, folks had a harder time accessing that information, or they might not have been aware that that information was readily available, right? So there was definitely kind of a breakdown here in kind of the information pipeline. And when we talk about how folks were feeling about information, generally, again, kind of talking about those broad overview workshops and webinars, folks tended to have favorable attitudes towards that, right? So when I asked folks, as someone just asked in the last Q&A portion, was I asking people about how they were taking in information and where they were getting it and what that was like? I did, and they found that they generally had favorable attitudes towards green infrastructure implementation. So you see a quote on screen from one of our interviewees who said, "I think that the several groups make it user-friendly for municipalities. They bring in their experts and it's all gone really well." So that's great. But research does show that attitudes towards information don't necessarily predict whether or not green infrastructure is going to be implemented. So what that just means is whether or not folks feel great about the information that's out there, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to take the next step and construct a green infrastructure project and make sure that that project succeeds over time, right? There's still something else that needs to happen. And again, when we talk about information, we can kind of relate this back to how useful the information itself is, right? So there was definitely a mixed, account of usefulness here, right? So some folks said that additional information would complicate things for them. They noted that bringing in more information to this overall topic might give them, a little bit more than they were prepared to deal with. In some cases, maybe having more surveying information, things like that, would uncover some unexpected costs or maintenance needs that they weren't prepared for, right? And in other situations, some folks found that the opportunities that they had because of more information being out there made the whole process way better than it used to be, right? So information really serving as a positive thing here. So that's kind of usefulness in a more theoretical sense, right? How theoretically useful is that information if you were to use it? When we talk about how folks actually did utilize that information, how they put it to use, we can talk about this idea of informational utilization, and that comes through in the output side, right? Because folks are, again, putting that to use and conveying it. We also found kind of mixed reports back here, though. Folks tended to not really rely on the information that existed that much, which is interesting considering how they were aware of it and tended to have good attitudes towards it. But most folks tended to rely more on experience and intuition versus relying on the information that exists. So they noted that, quote, there's no handbook on how to do all this stuff. It's experience over time that tells you what to do, when to do, how to do it, and to do it so you don't make mistakes, right? So again, really relying on kind of field experience versus the information that exists. And then something really interesting that came out on this idea of information related to green infrastructure has to do with communication. And I found that folks found it very difficult to communicate about what they said were the obvious benefits or co-benefits to green infrastructure. So several times I had different respondents report to me that they really understood the co-benefits of green infrastructure. They said those co-benefits were obvious and that, that they had a good understanding of that. But one of my interview questions was asking them, what do you see as the benefits to green infrastructure? And when I asked them to list those benefits out, there was some difficulty there. So you have a couple quotes on screen where someone said, I think we know in the back of our heads the benefit, but it's something we haven't really thought about. And someone else said, I feel like the benefits are obvious, but one of the hard parts is trying to show this, right? So this was really important here. Folks tended to feel like they had a good understanding of green infrastructure, but when it came time to, kind of explain what those benefits were, it tended to be difficult. And there could be an argument made here, maybe it was the structure of the interview questioning or the flow of the conversation, but I will note that the officials and the different, respondents that I was interviewing, they actually noted this themselves, right? So they reported back that they have a role in their communities of selling green infrastructure and putting the benefits of green infrastructure on display, right? And that can be to the elected officials that maybe they're working underneath, or maybe it's to the community and the constituents as a whole. But they noted that when they had to make the case in support of green infrastructure, doing that and selling it based on its co-benefits tended to be really difficult. So I would identify this as a very interesting communications breakdown here, right? Where folks tended to understand it, or at least kind of feel that they understood it, but when it came time to show it, there was definitely that breakdown. So those are our cognitive barriers. Now we can switch over to the other side and talk about perceptual barriers. And as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about external perceptions, those things outside of ourselves, funding and maintenance always come up as the two biggest challenges here, right? Funding tends to be seen as a perpetual challenge. Many municipalities in the state, they're constantly fighting for more resources. Capacity issues tend to be a challenge. There are issues around grant requirements and navigating how to apply for those and how to kind of secure the grant afterwards and keep up with it. And then we recognize that green infrastructure tends to be funded out of towns on an annual basis, right? So whether that's through general funds or capital improvement programs, or even from grants coming in. But because of that annual funding scheme, green infrastructure projects often have to compete with different priorities that also are competing for those same dollars. So in many cases, they won't be able to compete with those with those other projects going for those funds, and green infrastructure implementation might not happen for that project. And when we talk about maintenance, folks tended to see some burdensome maintenance challenges coming through on green infrastructure. So my interviewees tended to find green infrastructure to be a little bit more intricate and require more intense maintenance. And when we talk about that, this comes down to maintenance crews and equipment. In many cases, the local decision makers that I interviewed found that they needed specialized equipment to take care of green practices and make sure that they were maintained over time. So whether that was a large vehicle or some other specialized equipment, they felt that maybe that was expensive, maybe it took up too much space, or it wasn't really useful for anything else in town. And then when you talk about the crews who are doing the maintenance here, they felt that there was specific training that needed to happen. These crews needed to go through a process of understanding how the maintenance for green infrastructure is different from that of gray infrastructure. In some instances, in fact, in a couple different instances, I heard interviewees note that their maintenance crews would mow over maybe a bioretention basin or a bioswale, thinking that what was coming out of it were weeds, but in fact, those weren't weeds. Those were some of the plants that were planted on purpose to take in that stormwater and to treat it. So a perfectly good functioning best management practice might be mowed over just because of a kind of a maintenance breakdown there. And then on this last point on maintenance, I heard a lot about oversight and compliance, both from the public and the private sectors. So the municipalities that I talked to, some of them found it difficult to take care of or follow the oversight that was necessary on their broader portfolio of green BMPs. And someone noted that they were trying to start a database of where the BMPs are and what maintenance they needed over time. And then when you talk about compliance, in many communities, and some in Rhode Island and across the region, we see different incentive programs where folks in communities are incentivized to incorporate green infrastructure. But in doing so, they have to sign a maintenance agreement, and the compliance on that agreement can be very difficult for municipalities to follow up on. And then here are just some other kind of things that came up when we talked about external perceptions. So we've got physical conditions or maybe engineering challenges, the different issues that come up when we talk about a town's capacity or the size. And then issues also kind of came out here with the development community, making sure that developers incorporated green infrastructure in the beginning of a project and that the maintenance requirements thereof were passed along from the developer to the seller to whoever the home or the property buyer was after that. So those are our external perceptions, and we can finish up here with our internal ones and then move on to our recommendations. So I tended to find that there was generally good awareness of the different projects within a town that were related to green infrastructure, and there was generally good awareness on the local decision makers' behalf when we're talking about how the community or the leadership within a town was supporting green infrastructure, right? So when we talk about the different areas around green infrastructure that the local decision makers could be aware of, that tended to be pretty positive. When we talk about familiarity and understanding, it's a little different here. So folks tended to be more familiar than not with all of the green infrastructure best management practices, right? So I had a checklist with several different practices that I had identified as being suitable for the state of Rhode Island. And when I went through kind of one by one asking folks if they were familiar with those practices, they tended to report that they were. So that's great. And this quote here, just from another piece of research, shows that when familiarity is maximized, the perception of risk is reduced, and then adoption decisions tend to increase, right? So the more familiar we are with green infrastructure, the more likely we are to implement it. But when we talk about understanding, there was a generally good understanding, but there was some variance on what is considered to be green infrastructure. So we have this quote on screen where someone acknowledged that when I had asked them about green infrastructure, that they weren't really sure what that meant, right? They might have been thinking, I think here that they say they were talking more along the lines of stormwater quality, and they assumed that I was talking about stormwater quantity or localized flooding. And they acknowledge that maybe that misunderstanding was wrong, and I don't know that it necessarily is. I think there's just kind of a blur or, again, a miscommunication here, or a lack of clarity on what exactly we can be considering green infrastructure, and maybe what we should be considering green infrastructure to be. When we talk about folks' attitudes towards green infrastructure, theoretically, those were positive, right? So they tended to look at the information and anything that they were provided on green infrastructure. And on paper, they said that it generally looked very good and that they would support it. But in practice, we heard from several respondents that said that they were a little bit more ambivalent after they've had some experience with it, right? So there's a quote on screen where someone said, we're embracing green infrastructure, but we're also weary of it and some of the heavy lift that it can present. So again, kind of taking green infrastructure as a practice on paper, folks had good feelings towards it. But when you use it in practice, there tends to be more of an ambivalence there. And that relates back to the last slide where we talked about funding and maintenance. That ambivalence tended to tilt officials away from what they perceive to be the costs of green infrastructure, right? The direct funding costs and the more indirect maintenance costs that came along with it. And then this final point I'll make is on framing. And this was super interesting to me, finding that came out of this study. So I found that we could split most of our interviewees up into two categories, product framing and process framing, right? And I'll describe what each of those are. Most folks tended to fall in this idea of product framing, which seems to me like the more traditional way to view green infrastructure. So this is a really project-oriented approach, right? It's kind of a one-off way to incorporate green infrastructure on a case-by-case basis. And in doing so, there are really clear departmental boundaries here, right? So if you're in one of those communities where maybe the DPW takes care of stormwater management, green infrastructure might only happen in that department. And because of that, it's intended for a specific function, or there might be emphasis on only one of the benefits or a few of the different benefits, right? So in addition to stormwater management, we may not get any of the co-benefits actively leveraged for green infrastructure. Or maybe instead of going beyond stormwater quality, maybe there's also some stormwater quantity benefits, but we don't get anywhere near the public health or the recreation stuff. And this idea of product framing, green infrastructure tends to be the exception to the larger portfolio of gray practices throughout and underneath the community. And then we notice that product framing tends to be characterized by reactively seeking funding. So what that just means is folks would tend to identify a project and then look for funding that can support that project versus the other way around, which should be looking at a funding opportunity that exists from a granting agency or whatever, and then saying, based on that grant, what can we take out of our potential portfolio of projects that we can use to match up with that grant and try to secure those funds. So that more proactive approach to funding comes in the process framing. And this tends to be the less common framing. It's a little bit more novel, but this tends to be some real interest here, right? So it's a more policy-oriented approach. And by that, I just mean that a community might integrate green infrastructure across departments, right? And it does so comprehensively and it does so purposefully. So making sure that the different departments in a community are actively considering how green infrastructure can be leveraged for the different co-benefits that that department is responsible for and the different functions that green infrastructure can take care of. And we see gray as an exception to green here rather than the other way around. And for the sake of time, I'm going to skip these quotes, but you should all have the slides so you can look at those if you'd like. So that's our concept map, and we can wrap up here in the next few minutes, and we can spend the last 10 or so going over some questions. But now we've got our best practices. So I'll start with this first one. I recommend that we're leveraging the existing information providers that are out there and that we're following up when we have those specific information needs, right? So this directly tackles that idea that I mentioned earlier about having poor access to specific information, right? So where there is general information coming in from all these different providers that are listed on the right, and even more than those, That's great. We should keep that information coming, but we should also encourage those providers to diversify the offerings that they have, right? We should be targeting specific needs and increasing the impact of that information. So to that end, I would recommend to the information providers to consider diversifying the information that they're providing and to work directly with the communities to think about what that should be. And then for the communities themselves, I would recommend working with those providers and asking for information that is related to your case specific questions, right? And there are a couple of examples on how we might do that. Maybe there's a green infrastructure maintenance support group where folks get together on a routine basis to talk about the different maintenance successes or challenges or things that can be done there. Or maybe there are training sessions where we can talk about how to effectively communicate green infrastructure benefits that often seem obvious, but maybe are a little bit more difficult to articulate. As a second recommendation, I would say that it's always good to use pilot projects as a communication and a public outreach tool. So more than just a kind of technical dry run here, I recommend using pilot projects to kind of tackle those barriers that I talked about earlier on communication and how folks are understanding green infrastructure, right? So by using pilot projects to kind of aim at those really easy kind of low-hanging fruit projects, right? And using them to incrementally introduce a community to green infrastructure, we're able to tackle any of that dissatisfaction or the confusion that exists, and to do so, with that intention, right? Proactively do that. And at the same time, we're able to train the maintenance crews, work out any of the kinks, and funding becomes a little bit easier too with pilot projects. So all around, pilots tend to be kind of an easy way to slowly introduce a community to green infrastructure and to pull out those co-benefits that resonate with the community the most, right? So if you find that a more rural community tends to like the recreation aspects of green infrastructure, then maybe that's what you're really focusing on. And on the flip side, if it's a more urban community, maybe it's the walkability aspect that we need to really kind of leverage and elevate to that next level. On this third best practice, we'll talk about how we're understanding and emphasizing co-benefits. And I would really recommend that co-benefits are brought front and center at every opportunity. So I think in many cases, green infrastructure is made more efficient and more worthwhile when we're talking about co-benefits as well. And in some cases, I'm not sure that stormwater management sells green infrastructure on its own. I think that at times, just based on how traditional stormwater management is carried out, it may not make sense to put in a green practice. But when you start to address several community needs at once by looking at the co-benefits to green infrastructure and making sure we're pushing those and making sure the community is aware of them, we can kind of counteract those difficulties that come up when we sell green infrastructure to the community, right? And by elevating those co-benefits, we're really able to kind of make that case on our own. And then I have some examples of the potential co-benefits, which we talked about earlier, and everyone seemed to identify in that poll. But just as some other ones, we talk about recreation, walkability, the idea of beautifying a downtown and making a streetscape a little bit better. And then this example you see in the middle from Provincetown, Massachusetts, this was a transportation co-benefit. So a community that had runoff coming from its main street into its harbor, which harmed the water quality and led to beach closures, which had a direct impact on the income from tourism. They were able to repave a street with porous asphalt. And not only were they collecting stormwater runoff here, but they were also getting a brand new road, right? So leveraging those transportation benefits and making sure the community was aware of how that road kind of revitalized that area. And then finally, I'll finish up with this last one, which is just to approach green infrastructure with that process framing in mind. So really just making sure we're embedding green infrastructure into how a town manages stormwater, right? And rather than thinking about how we can make one green infrastructure project work, we should be asking how can green infrastructure be included across departments in practically every capital project. And that's not to say that it will work in every capital project, but we should be asking that question, right? It makes the process more efficient. Green infrastructure by nature will become a little bit cheaper. Those co-benefits will be pulled out. And then the community becomes more aware of it. They have more positive experiences with green infrastructure. And it allows us to kind of proactively secure funding for those projects. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I will leave it there. I will say thank you. If there is any interest in following up on this after today's webinar, my email is on screen, and you can get that as well from the slides and the handout on the GoToWebinar panel. But other than that, I will toss it over to Tess, and we can go through our Q&A.
Hi, Kyle. Thanks so much for that wonderful presentation. I'm already seeing a ton of comments coming in that are saying how appreciative folks are of this perspective. I want to start out by letting folks know we did get a question about where they could download the slides. And actually, if you just go to the handout section of GoToWebinar, you can directly download a PDF of the slides and take them with you today. And so with that, our first question, Kyle, is asking for an example of what you mean by diversify the information that tech providers can offer. Can you just remind us what you were referring to and offer an example of what some more specific information might be?
Yeah, great question. And I want to make sure that point's clear. So I'm glad that was asked. So again, that would go back to that point where there was really good general information on green infrastructure, right? We can think of like the Green Infrastructure 101 workshops, right? That's already out there, and folks tend to have a really good awareness of and access to that. When I'm saying diversify the information, I would mean to kind of get into the weeds on that, right? Get a little bit more in the case-specific information that the different municipalities need. And that has to be a two-way street when we're talking about how we need to diversify that. So providers, I think, should be kind of reaching out to municipalities and asking, what else do you need in terms of information? And kind of giving them that question to think about, what else would help? And then vice versa, the communities themselves should be reaching out when there is an information need, so that, we're not just kind of doubling down on the general information, that we get those specifics.
Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, and I'm reminded of one of your examples you made earlier was on site design. And site design is just one of those more advanced topics that often goes by the wayside. So it is really important for all the technical assistance providers to address those needs that come up once people are beyond the 101 level, as people are getting more and more information and understanding of these topics. Okay, the next question is, did towns indicate interest in passing GI bylaws or other process activities?
Very good question. That was not necessarily within the scope of this study, which kind of sounds like a cop-out answer, and I wish it was, and I wish we could cover all of that. So I would say informally, maybe out of the 14 or I guess 16 people that I interviewed, maybe 2 to 3, when I brought up this idea of maybe, focusing on bylaws or weaving green infrastructure into the community, incentivizing it even with a structured program. There were, like I said, maybe 2 or 3 communities that were, kind of interested in that. But again, that wasn't a big focus of this study. So it's hard to say whether or not they were interested. But I will note that outside of this research and just in kind of the other work that I've been involved in, there is an interest there, but I think there are a lot of different places where it can get held up. So I would say to push through when there is that interest, because they tend, at least in my experience, to work, and they can be a very effective way to go about doing that.
Great. And then one more question, and folks, remember you can continue to put questions into the chat box. We are running a little short on time, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. The question is, how did this research include understanding cognitive and perceptual barriers in more traditional or contemporary infrastructure? And I guess here, Kyle, what would be helpful is if your research on green infrastructure gave you any sense of whether that also applies to other types of infrastructure, or whether those barriers carry over in other ways.
Yeah, good question. So I'm not sure I necessarily thought about that during the study, but I guess I can kind of take a swing at it now. So I would say kind of the reverse would be true, based on what I said about green infrastructure, kind of the opposite with gray, right? So when we talked about maintenance earlier, it tended to be viewed as really intricate, kind of intense, more specialized for green infrastructure. So on the gray side, folks tended to feel, in comparison, that gray was not as much of a heavy lift, right? Maintenance crews already understood what that consisted of. Maybe there weren't those maintenance or equipment needs. So the similar barriers I would say are still present, but they're probably opposite for gray. Yeah, that's probably the most I have on that for the time being.
Yeah, and this brings us to a point Kyle and I had gotten together and discussed before we did this webinar, how it would be great to ask the audience that's on with us just an open-ended question, which is, what co-benefits of GI have you seen in practice, and what was your approach to leveraging those? So if you've seen municipalities do a really good job selling GI or shining the best light on it to get those co-benefits leveraged, will you type into the chat some of your experiences so that we can take a look at those and share that with everyone on? And then, sorry, Kyle, we did get one more question in here. Did municipalities indicate their preferred forms of training? And that can include webinars, site visits. And if so, did you get a sense of what those were?
Yeah, great question. So this whole research project was conducted kind of in the second half of 2020. That's when the interviews tended to take place. So everything was virtual. So site visits were a thing of the past, far out of everyone's mind. I would say webinars tended to be really popular, though. I had quite a few people note all of the different presentations that they had seen, from all the different providers that you saw on screen. So I think those webinars tended to work really well. In the small state of Rhode Island, people don't, want to drive up from South County to Providence to go to, a conference or something. So making it just accessible like that for people who can, watch a webinar during the middle of the day, and hear what they need to hear. That seemed to work.
Great, and that's encouraging to hear, since on the training side we've heard about Zoom fatigue for the last few months and how detrimental that's been. Oh, great. And in response to our open-ended question, Kyle, we had asked what kinds of co-benefits folks on our call had seen in practice. We just got a good response. Incorporation of dry wells into existing impervious school parking lots without loss of parking spaces, reduced lot local flooding. And we're also seeing that folks have seen GI projects in municipalities be highlighted as a visible form of public outreach to make the point, look at how much our town staff are working on, and it's a really good way to be an on-ramp for public outreach to broader topics of resilience. That's a fantastic insight.
Yeah, that's great. And I would double down on that last one that you just read off, Tess. When we think about gray stormwater infrastructure, it's all underground. And nobody can see that. So when we talk about co-benefits there really aren't many. There's not really much else a storm drain can do for you. There are no recreation benefits there. So exactly like this last person just said, you can tie public outreach into that. It's a great way to show how a community is taking action on something, and you can tie it to all these other co-benefits as well.
Fantastic. And I just saw one more, co-benefits of pollinator plantings, flood mitigation, and public education into all GI projects. So, moral of the story, Kyle, you mentioned, how officials had really a tough time selling the benefits and putting the benefits on display. And, it also was begging a question of perceived high cost. So it really is nice to see that there's folks out there doing their best to shine the best light on this topic. Okay, it's 2:59. I want to turn it back over to you, Kyle, for any closing comments and your takeaways for today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Tess. Thank you, Leah. I know you're in the background somewhere. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This is great, and I love talking about this research. I did see one other person ask if the PDF of the entire thesis was available. It is kind of on hold right now because it may be published. That's kind of up in the air. So if there's interest in reading that, feel free to shoot me an email, and I can always work with you on that. But just as a final thought, I would really double down on the fact that you have to leverage the co-benefits. It's, to me, from what I've seen, that's not the silver bullet, but it's pretty close, and it's the best thing we've got for that on green infrastructure. So do what you can on that, and I love to have these conversations. So always feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kyle. And thanks everyone for joining us and for sharing your thoughts in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye to all of you all for now, but take our survey when it pops up after the webinar closes and stay tuned for other SNP events. We love doing it and we'll take all of your comments into consideration. Okay, have a great afternoon.
Thanks so much, everyone.